London, 16th century. A city shrouded in damp mist, its cobbled streets slick with rain, the air thick with the choking smoke of coal fires. A city of trade and wealth, but also crime and punishment, ambition and fear. But within this sprawling metropolis, one place stood apart from the rest. A place where justice was carried out in the most brutal fashion imaginable. A place where the crowd's cheers mixed with the dying gasps of the condemned. Tyburn. The name alone was enough to make hearts race and hands tremble. It was not merely a gallows, it was a symbol of terror, a warning whispered in every alley, every tavern, every home. Here, criminals, traitors, and even those guilty of nothing more than unfortunate fate were led to their deaths. Some had stolen a loaf of bread, others had conspired against the crown. It did not matter. At Tyburn, there was no mercy, but it was more than a place of execution. It was a public theater of suffering. Crowds gathered by the thousands, not in mourning, but in anticipation. They came not to grieve, but to watch. They wanted to see justice or something far darker. They cheered, they jeered, they laughed. How did this place of death become one of London's greatest sources of entertainment? And who were the souls dragged to Tyburn, forced to play the leading role in its most gruesome performances? The first recorded mention of Tyburn dates back to 1196. At the time, it was nothing more than a modest execution site on the outskirts of London, a desolate place near what is now Marble Arch. But by the 16th century, Tyburn had become something else entirely. It was no longer just a gallows. It was an institution of death, a machine of terror. At its heart stood the Tree of Tyburn, a massive three-beamed wooden structure designed to execute multiple prisoners at once. In some cases, as many as 24 men and women were hanged simultaneously, their final gasps drowned out by the deafening cheers of thousands of onlookers. But the true horror of Tyburn wasn't just the act of dying. It was the journey leading to it. The condemned did not die quickly. They were bound, placed onto wooden carts, and dragged at a slow, deliberate pace through the winding streets of London. Along the way, they were spat on, cursed at, pelted with rotten food and waste. The journey was designed to break them before the rope ever did. Everything was carefully orchestrated, but for what purpose? It was not just about punishment, it was about spectacle, about sending a message that rang through the streets like a death knell: defy the crown, and this will be your fate. But was this justice? Or was it nothing more than a blood-soaked performance, a brutal entertainment for a crowd that craved suffering? And who were the unfortunate souls forced to take center stage in this macabre theater of death? An execution ground is nothing without an executioner, and at Tyburn they weren't just men with ropes. They were the specters of death itself. When a condemned soul was sentenced, all eyes turned to the gallows. But the true power didn't lie with the one whose hands were bound. It lay with the man holding the rope, the executioner. These men weren't just tools of the law. They were the final judges, the ones who decided how a prisoner would meet their fate. They didn't simply do their job. They wielded a terrifying authority. They could end a life instantly, or stretch the suffering for agonizing minutes. They could make death excruciating, or turn it into a swift, merciful release. And it all depended on one thing: money. A condemned prisoner could buy a quick death by bribing the executioner before the noose tightened. A single gold coin could mean the difference between a sharp, clean break or an unbearable slow end. But what if they had no money? The rope would tighten slowly. The prisoner would writhe, struggle, gasp for air, their lungs burning, their body convulsing in terror, their final moments stretching into a long, drawn-out nightmare, a glimpse of hell on earth before darkness took them. Some executioners, if particularly cruel or simply following orders, would pull the rope just enough to make the prisoner lose consciousness. only to release them slightly, forcing them to choke back to life, prolonging the agony. Everyone knew this secret, but not everyone could afford mercy. And whether they were killed fast or killed slow, one truth remained the same. At Tyburn, there was no room for mercy. Tyburn was no stranger to horrific deaths, but some executions weren't just about punishment. They were political statements. 1661, Oliver Cromwell. He wasn't just executed. He had already been dead for 3 years. Yet when the monarchy was restored, King Charles II wanted revenge, not just on the living, but even on the dead. He ordered Cromwell's corpse exhumed, dragged to Tyburn, and subjected to a posthumous execution. His lifeless body was hanged, beheaded, and mutilated, a symbolic act meant to erase his legacy. This was not justice, it was a warning, a message from the king himself. Even in death, treason will not be forgiven. And the final touch? Cromwell's severed head was placed on a spike above Westminster Hall, left to rot, a chilling reminder of royal authority. But it wasn't just men who met their fate at Tyburn. 1767, Elizabeth Brownrigg. A woman, but not a victim, a monster. Elizabeth Brownrigg was convicted of torturing and murdering her young servant, Mary Clifford. The girl's broken body, covered in deep wounds and scars, was a horrifying testament to months of brutal abuse. The people of London were outraged. Her execution was not just a punishment, it was a statement. No one who preys on the weak will escape justice. But some executions were cruel, not just in sentence, but in method. 1726, Catherine Hayes. She was burned alive, her crime, killing her own husband. But under England's brutal laws, there was a gruesome distinction between men and women. A man guilty of high treason would be hanged, drawn and quartered, his body carved apart as a warning to others. A woman guilty of the same crime, she was tied to a stake and set ablaze. There was no body left to bury, no remains to remember, only ash on the wind, and a grim lesson on what happened to those deemed traitors. For centuries, Tyburn stood as a chilling reminder of power, fear, and control, but even the most notorious symbols of brutality can't last forever. On November 3, 1783, a man named John Austin became the last person to be executed at Tyburn. With his death, the infamous gallows were finally retired. The executions didn't stop, but they were moved, taken out of public spaces, hidden behind the walls of Newgate Prison. But Tyburn itself, it didn't disappear. Its name remained etched in history, whispered through the streets of London like a ghostly reminder of a darker time. The scaffold was gone, the crowds had dispersed, but the blood-stained legacy of Tyburn refused to fade. And so, a question lingers. Was it truly justice? Or was it merely violence, disguised as law? A spectacle that fed the hunger of the masses. A stage where death was both punishment and entertainment. History remembers Tyburn, but what does it teach us? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching. See you in the next video.